In Total War Warhammer 3, it is actually possible to become completely immune to damage, as we can see with Tyrion here, who is bathing in a sea of arrows without a care in the world. The keys to doing this are armor and resistances, which are the two things that reduce how much HP a unit loses whenever it takes damage. In this video, I want to cover how both armor and resistances work, a bit of the math behind them, and some practical tips on how to make the most of them in battle. First up, I want to cover armor, both since it's applied before resistances, and also it just has a bit more going on. But before we can understand armor, we need to understand the two main types of damage that units do, base and AP damage. Every unit in the game does a certain amount of each with their attacks, and you can see the exact values when hovering over the weapon and missile damage on the unit card. For example, with these Empire Swordsmen, their melee attacks will do 21 base damage and 7 AP damage. As you can see from the tooltip, armor can reduce base damage but is ignored by AP damage. So if a unit is attacked by these swordsmen, it will always take the 7 AP damage, and the 21 base damage will be reduced by a certain percentage depending on their armor. The actual percentage the base damage is reduced by is equal to a randomly chosen value between 50 and 100% of the defender's armor value. To give an example, let's say we had those swordsmen attacking these Black Ark Corsairs. The Corsairs have 80 armor, so when the swordsmen land a hit, their 21 base damage will be reduced by anywhere between 40% and 80%. This means on average, the Corsair's 80 armor will reduce the swordsman's base damage by 60%. And the same pattern holds for armor values up to 100. For every point of armor a unit has, the base damage it takes will be reduced by an average of 0.75%. However, after 100 armor, there are diminishing returns with respect to the percent reduction, because damage can't be reduced by more than 100%. We can see this if we graph what this relationship looks like. The horizontal axis here shows the amount of armor a unit has, and the vertical axis shows the corresponding percent reduction against base damage. It's a linear relationship up to 100 armor, but we start getting diminishing returns after that, ultimately capping out at a hard limit of 200 armor, since at that point it's impossible to get less than 100% base damage reduction no matter how low the armor roll is. Remember though, that this graph shows the percent reduction against base damage only. Every unit in the game will do at least some AP damage as well, so the reduction from armor will only apply to a portion of the attacker's damage. If we want to calculate the protection armor gives against all damage, we need to take the base damage reduction from armor and scale it down depending on the ratio of base to AP damage that the attacker does. Using the same example as earlier, we can see 75% of the Empire Swordsman's damage is base, and the Corsair's armor reduces that base damage by 60%. If we multiply those two values, we get 45%, which means that after taking into account AP damage, the Corsair's armor is only reducing the Swordsman's total damage output by 45%. As you can probably guess, this means armor is less effective the more AP damage a unit has. If the Corsairs were instead facing White Lions of Crais, who do 9 base and 25 AP damage, their armor would only reduce the total damage taken by about 16%. If you're wondering, the damage increases from a unit's charge bonus and bonuses versus large or bonuses versus infantry will keep the same AP ratio as their standard weapon damage, so that won't change the math here, except maybe for some slight rounding differences in certain cases. So you can do that calculation we just discussed for any matchup of units, but unfortunately there isn't a quick rule of thumb to determine exactly what portion of a unit's damage is AP. The AP symbol on the unit card only tells you what the majority of the unit's damage is. If the symbol is there, the majority of the damage is AP. If it's not, the majority of the damage is base. However, things can vary a lot within those two categories. For example, let's look at Goblin Archers compared to Source Warriors. Neither of them have the AP symbol on their unit card, but while Goblins have a pitiful 9% AP damage, Source Warriors have nearly 35%. So the Source will perform considerably better against armor than Goblins, even though they both are considered non-AP units. The same thing goes for armor-piercing units. Grail Guardians only have 60% AP, while Glade Guard with Starfire Shafts have a pretty insane 89%. And on top of that, any unit that is ethereal, like Hex Wraiths or the Green Knight, will do 100% AP damage. My point in giving all these examples is just to say that if you want to fully understand how effective a unit is against armor, you have to check their unit card for the specific breakdown between base and AP damage. Before moving on, I want to briefly mention that all the same concepts apply to spells as well. And in fact, it's even simpler because each spell will directly show you the percent AP damage they do, so it's very straightforward to calculate how effective armor is against them. The only exceptions to this are direct damage spells like Spirit Leech or Flock of Doom, which will completely ignore armor. So to sum all that up, armor will reduce the base damage a unit takes by an average of 75% of the armor value, with diminishing returns after 100 armor. And to calculate the total damage reduction armor is giving a unit, you just need to scale that base reduction by the percentage of base damage the attacker is doing. Now for all practical purposes, that calculation will serve you fine, but, and this is where things get interesting, it's not technically correct. This is because armor can't actually reduce the amount of base damage a unit takes to less than 1. Every attack will do at least 1 base damage, even if the attacker has 0 base damage on their unit card. To accurately determine the total damage reduction a unit gets from armor, we need to account for this minimum, which is unfortunately a bit tedious to do. So to try and keep it simple, I just went ahead and calculated the total damage reduction, accounting for that base damage minimum against a sample of 4 units that represent the full spectrum of AP damage. And I'm hoping that will give you a rough idea of where all the different units in the game fall. The 4 units I chose are Goblin Archers, Saurus Warriors, Grail Guardians, and Starfire Glade Guard. And this is the result. This shows the total damage reduction for different armor values when being attacked by these 4 units. As you can see, it follows the same basic shape as we saw previously, starting with a linear increase and then diminishing returns. The difference here is that where armor's effectiveness caps out is determined by the attacking unit. For example, with Goblins, they do 10 base damage and 1 AP damage, which armor can only reduce to 1 base and 1 AP. So the most armor can reduce their damage is from the initial total of 11 down to 2, which is an 81% decrease. And as you can see, that's where the line levels out for the Goblins. More generally, once a unit has enough armor to consistently reduce an attacker's base damage to 1, getting more armor doesn't do anything for them. That's why the graph for the Starfire Glade Guard levels out super early at just 100 armor. They only do 2 base damage, so armor only needs to guarantee a 50% base damage reduction to hit the minimum of 1. So that's a good start, but I don't think looking at the percent reduction is the best way to understand how armor is helpful. What we actually care about is how much it increases a unit's survivability, how much longer they'll take to kill. It's not immediately clear how percent damage reduction translates to that. The much more direct way to measure the effect of armor is to look at effective HP, or just EHP, which tells us how much raw damage is needed to kill a unit when taking their defenses into account. This is something we can directly calculate from damage reduction, which makes things nice and simple. For example, if you had a unit with 100 HP and 90% damage reduction, their EHP would be 1000. This is because an attacker would need to deal at least 1000 damage so that, even after it's reduced by 90%, they still have enough damage left to get through the defender's 100 HP. In other words, a damage reduction of 90% would allow a unit to live 10 times longer. Effective HP is nice because it directly shows us that 10x increase, 100 to 1000. This is what plotting the EHP for those previous 4 units looks like. In this case, this is all relative to a defender who has 100 HP, which, for reference, is about the same as the HP of an individual Saurus Warrior. The main thing that stands out here, which is why I think this is more useful than the earlier graph, is that this shows armor actually doesn't have cleanly diminishing returns. Instead, it follows this unique pattern where at low amounts of armor, getting more increases a unit's effective HP relatively slowly. Then it starts to pick up once we hit around 60 to 80 armor, and then it slows down again once we start getting into the really high armor values. This might seem a bit strange at first, because from what we know, armor gives us less and less percent damage reduction after 100 armor. And on top of that, there's a hard minimum to how much it can reduce damage. So we'll get further diminishing returns as we approach that. So why does the graph look like this? The missing piece of the puzzle here is that percent damage reduction actually has massively increasing returns as you get more and more of it. To show you what this looks like, I graphed how total damage reduction increases a unit's EHP. As you can see, it picks up extremely quickly as we get more and more damage reduction. If you think about it, this is pretty obvious. A unit with 100% damage reduction would take literally no damage and have effectively infinite HP. That's also why I capped the graph at 99%, because otherwise the scale would just get ridiculous. To give you an idea of how strong this effect is, let's remember what we said earlier. Going from 0 to 90% damage reduction would increase the unit's EHP from 100 to 1000. By comparison, getting just another 9% from 90 to 99 damage reduction would increase EHP all the way to 10,000. With this being the case, we can understand why armor works the way it does, why the armor graph looks like this. At low values of armor, each point is giving a good amount of damage reduction, but that reduction isn't very valuable yet. It picks up a lot in the mid-range because we're starting to see the increasing returns from having higher damage reduction, while still getting a good amount from each point of armor. Then as we get to the high end, it slows down a lot as we get less and less damage reduction from each point of armor, and especially because we start to run against the hard minimum of how much armor can actually reduce damage. Now that we know what armor does and how it works, what are the takeaways? How should this change how you play the game? The most important thing to understand is simply that armor can be very, very strong, potentially allowing a unit to survive attacks several times longer. But its effectiveness drops off a lot once you start facing opponents with significant amounts of AP damage. Something to keep in mind in this regard is that units with high AP will, not always, but usually, have some sort of trade-off compared to similarly tiered units with less armor piercing. For example, with Chaos Warriors. Compared to the standard sword and shield variant, the Great Weapon version gains a bit more melee attack and damage, but they lose their silver shields and a lot of melee defense. Against heavily armored units, the fact that they do so much more AP will usually increase their damage by more than enough to be worth it, but in other situations, like if they're getting shot by missiles or fighting chaff that has very little armor, they'll probably be less efficient than the normal Chaos Warriors. So, and I admit this is a bit obvious, you really want to try to match your troops to what they're best at. If possible, have your AP units focus enemy armor, and likewise try and keep your own heavily armored units away from enemy armor piercing. The other thing that the graph tells us is that if you're doing anything to augment armor, like a spell or ability that increases your own troops' armor or decreases the enemy's, you should generally focus on units that aren't at the extreme ends of having either very low or very high armor, since changes there are less effective. For example, if you're playing Empire, you would usually be better off casting Glittering Robe on your swordsmen or halberdiers rather than on your flagellants. To be clear though, the effectiveness of armor augments will depend on both the starting armor of the unit receiving the augment as well as the damage of whatever's attacking them, so the specifics will vary from situation to situation. This is just a very rough guideline. The next important thing to keep in mind is that armor directly translates to percent damage reduction, which has a multiplicative effect on HP. This means that, all else being equal, the same increase in armor will be more effective on a unit the more hit points it has. For example, if you're playing Grand Cathay, you get more effective HP out of buffing the armor of your Jade Warriors compared to your Crossbowmen, because while they both have the same armor, the Warriors have more HP. Finally, another big thing where armor comes into play is skill selection for lords and heroes. Most combat characters will normally have the option to invest skill points to get armor, among many other things. Assuming you're focusing on increasing their defenses, the three main options are plus 15 armor, plus 15% HP, or plus 12 melee defense. I'm showing Franz here, but these notes are the same for many other characters in the game. So which one is better? To start, 15 armor would take Karl from 100 to 115, which, looking at our graph, in the best case scenario when fighting goblins, would increase his EHP by 24%, but against Saurus would only increase it by 13%. This would of course drop even further if we were fighting units with higher HP. By comparison, HP will give a flat 15% EHP increase, which, unlike armor, works against everything, including AP damage and direct damage spells, and on top of that, it can't be reduced by things like sundering effects or fatigue the way armor can, so it'll usually be a lot better. Melee defense is similar. I don't have time to cover all its intricacies in this video, but 12 MD will typically drop enemies' chance to hit a unit by 12%, for example from 50% to 38%. So you can kind of think of it like a plus 12% damage reduction against all melee damage, regardless of how much AP there is. And while it doesn't help with ranged attacks like armor does, most of the time your characters are going to be fighting in melee, so melee defense is a lot more impactful. Maybe if you have a big lord who's a huge target, so they get shot a lot, and that shooting isn't heavily AP, armor could be better. Or if you have a ranged hero you'd never send into melee. But otherwise, MD will probably win out. So in general, when it comes to skill points, increasing armor should be a very low priority. You will almost always have better options. That's all there is to armor, but it alone won't make a unit immortal like Tyrion was in the intro. If you want to get there, you also need resistances, which fortunately are a lot less complicated. After armor is taken into account, resistances reduce the remaining damage by the specified percentage. There are 5 types which determine what damage is resisted. There are missile, fire, physical, and spell resistances, which only work against the specified damage type, and finally also general damage resistance, also known as ward save, which works against everything. Resistances are additive and capped at 90%. This means that when a unit takes damage, all the unit's applicable resistances will be added up, and the final damage will be reduced by that amount, up to the cap of 90%. So to give a quick example, let's look at the Sisters of Averlorn. Their missile attack is flaming and magical, so it would of course be reduced by ward save, then on top of that by missile resist, because it's a missile attack, and flaming resist, because it's a flaming attack. But because it's magical, it will ignore physical resist. And of course it won't be affected by spell resist, since it's not a spell. Then let's say they were to shoot at Dragon Princes, which have 20 physical and 25 fire resist. The Sisters' damage would only be reduced by 25%. Their magical attacks allow them to ignore the physical resist, but they're still affected by the 25 fire resist. That's really all there is to it. The main tip I can give in terms of how to use resistances is that stacking them is really good. Because they have increasing returns with respect to effective HP, every additional point of resistance you get will be more effective than the last, until you hit the 90% cap. The other thing is that you should try to combine them with armor if possible, since the two kind of work together. In particular, resistances are able to cover for armor's main weakness, which is AP damage. So if you have a unit with high armor already, you might prefer to buff its resistances instead of armor, because that will shore up its defenses against AP damage. Whereas if you were to just give that unit even more armor, it would maybe be a bit more effective against base damage, but still completely exposed to armor piercing. And there can be a lot of armor piercing in this game. So with all that being said, we can now understand how Tyrion was able to become immortal in the intro. As a baseline, he has 125 armor, 15 missile res, and 40 fire res. On top of that, I added Faw's protection, glittering robe, and flesh to stone. With all that, he has 215 armor, 60 phys res, 15 missile res, and 40 fire res. The units shooting at him were Hobgoblin archers, which do 14 base damage and 2 AP damage, taking into account their passive. They also do flaming, non-magic missile attacks, so all of Tyrion's resistances are applied here, which means he's capped out on both armor and resistances against the Hobgoblin archers. When a Hobgoblin arrow hits Tyrion, first the 215 armor reduces the base damage by 100%, which brings it down to that minimum of 1, since we can't get all the way to 0. So now after armor, the Hobgoblins are doing 1 base and 2 AP damage, for 3 total. The 90% resistance Tyrion has then reduces that further to 0.3 damage. And finally, because this game doesn't track partial HP values, that's truncated to 0, so the archers end up doing nothing to Tyrion. I hope all this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.